First of all, thank you very much for your feedback and thoughts on the videos. It's feedback like this that is essential for these videos to get to the level of quality I want them to. Justin C., you're absolutely right. I had to do the same. Truth be told, I was rather embarrassed about my audio quality at louder volumes. Of course, turning the gain down is not a viable fix, and more hides the issue with a different issue than fixing it. I made sure to render the headache video at a louder volume so that others aren't encumbered by the same issue. Thanks very much for the kick in the butt to turn it up. Eindhoven's Triangle, thanks very much for the feedback. I'm happy to hear you like the scenarios. As for a discussion on the gloves, I wish I could be a fly on the wall to hear what your students' thoughts are in this very difficult scenario. I don't believe there is any true right answer, and yes, a lot of different variables can influence one's decision. From a utilitarian perspective, things like the number of people in the vehicle come into play, and I'm not even going to try and approach this from a Kantian categorical imperative angle. I hardly even passed my bioethics class in school, so I'm not anywhere close to qualified to comment on that. Hopefully some wise people come along like you mentioned. I think a PPE alternative is a totally viable option, although it depends what hazards you're facing. Any blood on scene, like in this situation, I personally would only want gloves manufactured specifically for the purpose of protecting me from that hazard. Anything else would be outside of my risk tolerance. It's not worth my life, license, or putting all my future patients until the end of my career at risk with one less paramedic in the world because of a single chance I took with bodily fluids. Although it would eat me up from the inside out afterwards, I can only hope that I would have found some way to postpone my physical contact with a patient until proper safety equipment is acquired. No way to know for sure what I would have done, having thankfully not ever experienced this exact situation in my career. Although I'm no stranger to employers resisting the purchase of proper PPE, I know practitioners who have been in a no PPE situation, and it's very valuable to consider your options beforehand. I know paramedics who would risk it, I know paramedics who would refuse to make physical contact with a patient, and I've met even other paramedics who would go so far as to exercise their right to refuse unsafe work, which in Alberta, Canada, occupational health and safety legislation provides this right, and all other Canadian provinces if I'm not mistaken. But I understand not everyone watching this video is from Canada, so different demographics come into play. It's great to hear from an instructor, especially one who doesn't mind the what-if questions. I remember in school we would drive our instructors absolutely nuts what-ifing every situation to death. I hear you on the mandatory unit inspections before rolling out, definitely a huge best practice everyone should follow. But as human factors play into the following of this best practice, the fatigue of long shifts, difficult calls, stress from the outside world, and just plain old complacency take their toll. Errors can happen. And the all too familiar Murphy's Law will forever ensure that anything that can happen, will. You've summed it up perfectly. Either way you're going to lose, and being stuck between a rock and a hard place, either way there's going to be an impact. It is really great to hear from someone practicing in another country. It is one of the things I looked forward most in publishing these videos. I had no idea the culture in Germany involved having so much PPE readily available. I've not done any formal research in Canada, but I'd fathom a guess you're more likely to find an empty discarded Tim Hortons cup in a bystander's personally owned vehicle than gloves. If this is indeed the case, I think some public education is in order in Canada, although a good chunk of vehicles owned by companies are required to carry first aid equipment, so we do have that. And AEDs are becoming more and more readily available here, which usually come with some gloves. It's interesting to hear a snippet of what DNRs can and can't do in your country. I'm afraid I can't comprehend very well what you write after your comment about this, where you say are even required to avoid that situation happening. I will share that in Canada, DNR can include a "don't even help me for shortness of breath" order, and I have personally attended on a transport to hospice where essentially, due to a DNR, all I was legally allowed to do is watch a person quite aggressively die on the way to our destination. That was not a very happy day. I am very well aware that by doing so I was respecting the patient's wishes and personal care directive, and that all she had to say was, "help me," and I could have chucked the DNR out the window, but she was determined that that day would be her last. I kept telling myself that this is what the patient wants, so I did what I could in keeping her as comfortable as I could by readjusting her pillows and blankets on the stretcher. Although in retrospect, I think this action was more for my comfort than hers. Made it feel like I was doing something. I totally agree with reporting to police being the right course of action for the domestic violence case, and it is absolutely the course of action I take in every case of domestic abuse. This was a scenario with a more straightforward right answer to take, and is more for the inexperienced, new, or student paramedics to consider before actually being in that situation. Although I respect your comment on being exposed to liability from not reporting, it's important to make the distinction this video is about ethics, not law. I'm talking in this video about what the right and wrong thing is to do, not the legal and proper procedural thing is to do. In this case, thankfully, the two align. I'm interpreting from your comment that all cardiac arrests must be declared dead by a physician, and you do not have the protocols for withholding resuscitation without online medical direction? I sometimes wish I worked in this environment, would make these situations a lot easier. Technically, I have to break protocol where I work, because I'll resuscitate anything, even when there are clear procedures set out to not even start CPR. For example, rigor mortis. I'm sure someday I'll grow out of this, but it just feels so wrong to say, I'm sorry, there's no hope. Especially when there are family members on scene. Running codes like this where I work are termed therapeutic resuscitations and are more for the family and good public relations. I've met paramedics who can look at a corpse with family members on scene and declare the person dead after a physical exam and explain to the family they'd just be damaging the body by doing CPR. But that's just stone cold, man. I could not do that. I'd rather be able to look the family in the eye and confidently say I did everything I could, even if what I did couldn't have possibly helped. The morgue can repair whatever damage I do to a body if that's important to the family. What they can't do, though, is change the doubt a family member might eventually have about everything possible being done. Suicides, in my opinion, are the most uncomfortable call a paramedic can go to. The idea of a human being taking their own life is a difficult one to wrap my head around. In all cases I can think of, my response is the same. If you want to kill yourself, you better do a good job of it. Because if you don't have a DNR, I'm coming lights and sirens, and it's going to be me versus you. It's not my position, nor am I qualified to debate the merits of your decision to take your own life, no matter what novella you wrote for me. It's for someone else to decide. Especially since Canada is on the verge of having an assisted suicide option pretty soon, if not already by the time this video comes out. Sounds like there were even discussions at one point in time of paramedics being the deliverers of this assisted suicide service, but I think based on some emails I've received recently, that's been quashed. Yes, regulations, procedures, and algorithms are in place at many places of paramedic employment for common situations the paramedic will encounter, like domestic violence and do not resuscitate orders. Other employers, not so much. For these employers, you have to do what a mentor of mine once told me and get good at operating in the gray area. You could go through your career blindly following policies and procedures, and that's okay. The question posed in this video, though, is not what the procedural thing to do is, but consider what society sees as the right thing to do, or what society sees as the lesser of two wrongs, what our individual opinion is of right and wrong in these scenarios, and what decision we figure we would make, and whether or not we could be comfortable with that action taking into consideration the sometimes opposing sides of ethics and morals. Thanks again for your input. I'm really working hard to create fresh content.